She had 3 minutes to hide the primer, and the primer would not close. The little book had swelled with damp from the tackroom roof, and now its cover refused to lie flat, refused to be tucked beneath the folded saddle blanket where she kept it, refused, in fact, to do the one small thing she needed of it. Somewhere along the gravel drive a pair of boots was coming closer, unhurried, expensive, the kind of walk that never had to prove anything to anyone. Eleonora Whitcomb pressed the book against her palm as if pressure might teach it obedience, and when it still would not obey, she slid it, still open, under the blanket and set an old hoof-pick on top of it and drew a breath through her nose that was meant to steady her and did not. Behind her, at the low bench by the harness pegs, 3 boys sat very still, their slates blank across their knees, their chalks pinched between fingers that already smelled of oats. The eldest, Tom, who had a face like a pear left too long in the sun, put his slate down at once and pretended to be interested in a buckle. The middle one, Ned, who at 9 had a solemnity that would have suited a bishop, laid his hands on his knees and looked at nothing. The youngest, whose name was really Small Gem because there had been a Big Gem before him and no one had thought to arrange another, put his thumb in his mouth because that was the only strategy Small Gem had ever needed. The boots reached the doorway. She heard them stop. She did not turn. It was one of the rules she had made for herself back in the earliest weeks when she had discovered that turning too quickly was mistaken by certain men for eagerness, and eagerness in certain wives was mistaken for guilt. So she straightened a strap that did not need straightening and lifted her chin the exact half-inch her aunt had taught her was called dignity. And only then did she look. He filled the doorway the way weather fills a valley. Tall, dark-haired, still gloved from riding, his coat cut so cleanly against the gray afternoon that he might have been drawn there with a pen. Adrian Ravenhill, 6th Duke of Marchwood, her husband of 142 days, was looking not at her but at the 3 boys on the bench, and then at the slates, and then at the blanket with its small, treacherous lump beneath it, and finally, unhurriedly, at her. She had a few seconds to decide what her face would do. She chose stillness. She had learned, in the season that had passed since the church, that stillness cost him more than tears. Tears he could dismiss. Stillness he had to interpret, and interpretation, for a man who preferred to be the one interpreted, was a small daily inconvenience. She let her hands rest on the wood of the bench and did not move them. He did not fill the silence. He looked, instead, at Tom, and Tom, who feared him honestly, dropped the buckle. It made a bright, mortifying sound on the flags. Nobody picked it up. Somewhere in the yard, a horse blew out through its nose, and a bucket touched a stone, and a swallow that had built above the door a week ago made its ordinary business of flight, and none of it disguised the fact that 4 people in a tack room were waiting on one man to speak, and the man was choosing not to. Eleonora considered, in that pause, that if she lived to be very old, she would remember this exact texture of light on the whitewashed wall, the way it seemed to lean in, curious, and how the smell of leather and clean straw and horse and lamp oil all belonged together, in a way she herself had never belonged in the great cold rooms of the house behind her. She considered, too, that the primer under the blanket had been given to her by her father the week before he died, when she was 9, and thought that all the world might be understood if only you were allowed to sit still with a book long enough, and that the boys on the bench had learned in 6 weeks to make the letters of their own names, and that Small Gem, who could not yet manage his surname, had at least mastered the loop of the J, because she had told him it was the shape of a fishing hook, and Small Gem knew fishing hooks. She considered all of this in the length of a breath, and then the Duke said, mildly, as if inquiring after the price of hay, "Am I interrupting a lesson?" It was not a question. It never was. He had a way of using the shape of a question and stripping it of its function so that what remained was only the courtesy of the form. She had learned in 142 days that answering the shape of it was a mistake. Answer the shape, and you conceded the form. Answer the meaning underneath, and you refused him the pleasure of pretending he had only politely inquired. So she said, "You are not interrupting." We had finished. Tom, who had a talent for exactly the wrong moment, said, "We hadn't done the bees yet." Ned kicked him. Small Jem removed his thumb. The Duke did not smile. He very rarely smiled, and never with the visible part of his face. When amusement moved him, it moved only the corner of one eye, and even that only for people who had learned to watch. Eleonora had learned to watch. She saw the corner of the eye move now and did not know whether to be relieved or afraid. He stepped inside. The tack room, which had been generous a moment before, became a small room. He did not look at the blanket. He looked at the boys, one by one, with the mild attention a man might give to 3 coins of unfamiliar denomination. "Boys," he said, "out." Ned rose first, because Ned always did the correct thing at the correct time, and would, Eleonora had privately decided, one day run the whole estate if he was permitted. Tom rose because Ned rose. Small Jem rose because his brothers rose, and because there was a bucket in the yard that suddenly seemed to need him. They went past the Duke in a little procession of stockinged shins and lowered heads, and Small Jem, who had not been taught to be afraid of anyone yet, looked up on the way by and said, with the calm of a very young person, "Good day, sir." The Duke inclined his head, exactly 1/4 of an inch, and said good day. Small Jem went out into the world content. The door swung shut behind them of its own accord, being ill hung, and the tack room settled around Eleonora and her husband like a held breath. He did not speak. He walked, instead, once around the small room. In the unhurried way, he walked around everything he owned, and stopped at the bench, and lifted the hoofpick, and lifted the blanket, and looked at the primer with its stubborn open pages, its damp swollen spine, the pencil marks in the margins where a child had traced a letter for the first time. He did not touch it. He looked at it for the length of time it takes a candle wick to draw fresh wax. Then he set the blanket back exactly as she had folded it, and the hoof pick on top, and turned. "Eleonora," he said. He almost never used her name. He had spent the greater part of 100 days calling her, in company, my wife, and in private, madam, and once, memorably, at a dinner in the county town where her sleeves had been the wrong cut, nothing at all. To hear her name in his mouth now was to feel a small door open in a wall she had believed to be solid. She did not let her face show it. "Yes," she said. He looked at her a long moment, whatever he had come to the stables to say to her, whatever mockery he had rehearsed on the walk down from the house, whatever cool remark about how a duchess spent her afternoons, none of it arrived. What arrived, instead, was silence. She let the silence hold. He did not fill it. And in the tack room, with the swallow going about her ordinary business above the door, and the horses breathing in the loose boxes, and the primer swelling quietly under its blanket, Eleonora Whitcomb understood, without yet knowing why, that the season she had endured was over, and that whatever was beginning now was not going to be endured in the same way at all. To understand how she came to be teaching stable boys in a tack room, and why the Duke of Marchwood had walked down to find her doing it, one must go back to the wedding, though she preferred, herself, not to. It had been a small wedding by the standards of the family, and an enormous one by the standards of anyone else. She had walked up the aisle of St. Bartholomew the Less on her uncle's arm, wearing a gown chosen for her by her aunt, in a lace that did not suit her, of a color that flattered no one. She had been aware of this. She had also been aware that the Duke of Marchwood, waiting at the altar, had looked once at her as she came up the aisle, and then, having taken her in, had looked politely past her, as a man looks past a picture whose merits he has already assessed and found modest. She had not blushed, she had thought, very clearly. So that is how it will be. And had walked the remaining 12 steps at exactly the pace her aunt had drilled into her, and had made her responses in a voice that carried. And had signed her name in the register in the careful hand her father had taught her when she was 6, and had left the church a duchess. In the carriage, going the 4 miles from the church to the great house, he had not spoken. She had not either. She had looked out at the hedges, which were in full green, and thought about a line from a book she had read as a girl about how a hedge in June was the most obliging of walls, being green on both sides and blaming no one for existing. It had made her smile, small and inward, and she had turned her face slightly toward the window so that he might not see the smile and mistake its cause. He had seen it. She learned later that he saw a great many things. He had not, however, asked. That was the pattern from the beginning. He saw and did not ask. She endured and did not explain, and in this way 142 days had passed, at the end of which he had walked into a tack room and stood over a stubborn primer and said her name. The house he had brought her to was called Marchwood Hall, and it was very old and very beautiful and very cold. Not cold in temperature, though it was that too, in the way of houses built by people who believed a fire was a moral test. Cold in the way rooms are cold when they contain more portraits than persons. There were 73 rooms, she had been told, on the tour her housekeeper had given her the morning after the wedding, with the practiced flatness of a woman who had shown a great many young wives around a great many corridors. 73 rooms, and at that moment, 4 people living in them, if one did not count the servants, and Mrs. Peake very much did not count the servants. The 4 were the Duke, his aunt Lady Mercia, a small yellow dog called Bosun, who bit anyone who was not the Duke. And, from that morning onward, Eleonora, she had been shown the library, which was enormous and locked. She had been shown the long gallery, where 7 Ravenhill dukes and 1 Ravenhill duchess looked down from oil, with expressions ranging from mild surprise to open disapproval. She had been shown the yellow drawing room, in which she was to receive callers, and the blue drawing room, in which she was to receive family, and the green drawing room, which was not to be used at all because a cousin had died in it in 1789, and no one had felt like sitting there since. She had been shown her own rooms, a suite of 3, in the west wing, connected by a door that Mrs. Peake, without meeting her eye, had said was her Grace's private door, and not, on any account, to be considered a corridor. She had been shown the stables last, almost as an afterthought, because it had begun to rain, and Mrs. Peake had thought perhaps another day, but Eleonora had said, quite politely, "I should like to see them now." And Mrs. Peake had said, with the very small tightening of the mouth that in her constituted rebellion, "Very good, madam," the stables, when she reached them, wet through and shivering slightly under the shawl that had been chosen for her by her aunt and did not suit her, were the first place in Marchwood Hall in which she had breathed all the way to the bottom of her lungs. There were 16 horses, and each one had a name, and each name was painted above its box in a plain, honest hand, and the man who ran the stables was called Mr. Fenwick, and Mr. Fenwick had touched his cap and said, with no ceremony at all, "Welcome, ma'am. We're glad of you." She had almost cried. She had not, because her aunt had drilled that out of her too. But she had said, "We, sir?" And Mr. Fenwick had gestured with his chin toward the yard, where 3 boys in stockinged shins were watching her from behind a water butt and had said, "The lads and me, ma'am. There is Tom, and there is Ned, and there is Small Jem, and there is not much sense between the 3 of them yet, but they'll get there." Small Jem, who had already ascertained that no one had told him to be afraid of her, had come out from behind the water butt and said, "You're the new one." Ned had kicked him. Tom had said, "Sorry, ma'am, he's little." Small Jem had said, quite reasonably, "I know I am." And Eleonora, standing in her wet shawl in a wet yard in a great house that had, until that moment, refused to fit her, had laughed. The laugh had surprised her. It had surprised Mr. Fenwick, who was not accustomed to duchesses laughing in his yard. It had surprised the horse nearest her, who had put its head out and blown warm hay-smelling breath onto her wrist, apparently in approval. Mrs. Peake, watching from the door of the tack room with her arms folded, had not been surprised, because she was a woman who had, on principle, given up being surprised in 1802. But Mrs. Peake had, that evening at supper in the servants' hall, said, quietly, to no one in particular, "She's a plain little thing, but she has a heart," and Mrs. Peake did not offer that observation lightly. Word travels, in a house of 73 rooms and 42 servants, faster than it does in a village. Within a week, the household had a picture of the new Duchess. She was quiet. She was plain. She rose early. She read at breakfast, which was not comme faut, but was not, on reflection, forbidden. She had asked Mr. Fenwick's permission before touching any horse in the yard, which had earned her Mr. Fenwick's good opinion, and Mr. Fenwick's good opinion was, in that establishment, worth more than a bishop's. She had made no fuss about her rooms. She had refused, politely, 3 separate offers of a lady's maid from the London registry, and had, instead, taken on a girl called Mary from the village who had needed the place and had a talent for pinning hair without pulling. She spent, the servants agreed, an unaccountable amount of time in the library door. Looking at the library door, which was, of course, locked, this last item was reported, in due course, by a housemaid to a footman, and by the footman to Mr. Coates, the butler. And Mr. Coates, the butler, did what Mr. Coates, the butler, did with all information above a certain weight. He mentioned it, in passing, to the Duke, one evening as he set down the port. "Her Grace," said Mr. Coates, without expression, "has been observed at the door of the library." The Duke had not looked up from his book. "Which door?" he had said. "The main, sir. And what has Her Grace been doing at the door of the library?" "Looking at it, sir. The Duke had turned a page. Has she asked for a key?" "She has not, sir. The Duke had turned another page." "That will do, Coates." Coates had bowed and gone, and the Duke, whose face never showed anything at all, had sat for some minutes with his finger on the same paragraph and had not read it. What Coates did not know, because Coates was not in the habit of watching men who paid him, was that the Duke had, the following morning, gone himself to the library, unlocked the door, walked once around the room, chosen a small volume of essays from a low shelf, and left it in the yellow drawing-room, on the table by the window at which he had noted, without appearing to note, that his wife preferred to sit. He had said nothing to her about it. She had said nothing to him about it. But that evening, when she came down to dinner, the volume was in her hand, a ribbon marking her place at page 31, and across the long, polished acre of the dining table he had said, mildly, over the soup, "Do you find Hazlitt agreeable?" And she had said, without looking up, "I find him honest," which is not always the same thing, and he had, for the second time in 142 days, felt the corner of his eye move. He had not let it show. That was the arrangement. It was, she came to understand, an arrangement of arrangements. There had been an arrangement between his father and her uncle, made when she was 14 and he was 22, involving a piece of land at Coldbrook and a debt that was not, strictly, hers to pay. There had been an arrangement between his aunt Lady Mercia and her aunt Lady Whitcomb, made in the year he came into the title, involving the eventual disposal of an unmarried niece of adequate family and inadequate looks. There had been, most recently, an arrangement between the Duke himself and, apparently, his own sense of duty, involving the acceptance of a bride he had never courted into a house he did not intend to warm. She had known all of this before the wedding. She had not been angry about it. Anger, she had decided, at 15, on the night of her father's funeral, was an expensive dress and she could not afford it. Composure was cheaper. Composure could be re-hemmed. She had worn composure into the church, and into the carriage, and into the 73 rooms, and up to the door of the library, and out into the wet yard where 3 boys had stared at her from behind a water butt. And composure, 6 weeks into her marriage, on a Tuesday afternoon when Mrs. Peake was overseeing the airing of the summer linen, and Lady Mercia was writing a very long letter of grievance to a cousin in Bath, had walked her down to the stables, and had sat her on a low bench in the tack-room, and had put a slate on her knees, and had said, in a voice she had used to no one else in that house, "Boys, would you like to learn your letters?" Tom had said, "Missus, we cannot pay." Ned had said, "We haven't the time." Small Jem had said, "Yes," and Eleonora, whose composure had, at that moment, briefly and privately buckled, had said, "You do not need to pay, and time we will find," and had opened the primer her father had given her when she was 9, and had begun. They came on Tuesdays, and then on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and then, quietly and without discussion, on any afternoon when the yard was slack and the horses did not need them. Mr. Fenwick, who was a man of few words and firm opinions, said nothing about it either way, which in Mr. Fenwick's language was permission engraved on a plate. He arranged, without being asked, that the tack-room fire be lit on lesson days, and that a jug of small beer be set on the bench for after, and that the boys wash their hands in the horse trough before they came in, which they did, and their necks too, unprompted, because Ned had decided that necks were part of the arrangement. Eleonora sat on the low bench with the slates on her knees and the primer open beside her, and taught. She taught the way her father had taught her. She began with the shapes of the letters and the sounds of the letters, and only then, when the shapes and the sounds had made friends, with the names. She let Small Jem call the letter J a fishing hook for as long as he needed to, and she let Ned insist that the letter Q was a cat sitting down with its tail out, and she let Tom, who had a natural tenderness for the letter O, draw it larger than any other. She did not correct their voices. She did not correct their grammar. She corrected only the letters, and only kindly, and only when they asked. She discovered, without surprise, that Ned had the quicker mind and Tom the truer patience, and Small Jem the deeper heart, and she loved them, quite privately, in the exact proportions their differences deserved. She discovered other things, too. She discovered that Small Jem's mother had died the winter before, of the fever that took also the blacksmith's wife and the vicar's youngest and the boy who used to bring the eggs. She discovered that Tom sent half his wages home to a sister in the village who was raising a child not her own. She discovered that Ned, at 9, could already reckon a bill of hay in his head faster than she could on paper, and had been doing it without credit for Mr. Fenwick for a year. She discovered that none of them had ever, in their lives, been read a story. That last discovery lodged in her like a splinter. She said nothing about it, at first, because she had learned that pity, even the kindest, was a form of trespass, and that boys, especially small ones, could feel it across a room. She waited. She waited 3 lessons, And on the 4th, when the letters were done and the slates were wiped and the small beer was drunk, she opened a book she had brought down from the house. A plain green volume of tales she had had since she was 7, and she said, in a voice she made ordinary, "Would you mind if I read a little? I like to read aloud, and there is no one at the house who cares to hear me." Small Jem, who had no defenses against a lie told in his favor, said, "We don't mind." Tom said, "No, Mrs." Ned, who saw through everything, said nothing, but he shifted on the bench so that his shoulder touched hers, which was, from Ned, an entire speech. She read to them, that afternoon, the tale of the tailor's son and the 3 copper pennies, and she read it slowly, because they had no rush, and she read it with the small changes of voice her father had used with her, and when she came to the end and closed the book, Small Jem said, "Again." She read it again. She did not, that day, know that Mr. Fenwick had stood outside the door for the whole of the second reading, and had cried, quite privately, into his sleeve. She did not know that Mrs. Peake, coming down the drive with a message for the head groom about the state of the summer linen, had heard the reading through the open window and had stood still on the gravel until it was done. She did not know that Mrs. Peake had gone back up the drive without delivering the message, and had said, that evening in the servants' hall, quietly, to no one in particular, "She reads to them," and that Mr. Coates, hearing it, had set down his fork, and had not, this time, mentioned it to the Duke. She did not know these things because she was busy. She was busy, on Wednesdays and Fridays, in the schoolroom nobody used in the North Wing, copying out simple sentences in her own hand, so that on Tuesdays and Thursdays the boys would have fresh work. She was busy, on Mondays, arranging with the cook, quite casually, that a small extra loaf be sent down to the tack room with the small beer, because Tom, she had noticed, ate as if he had not eaten. She was busy, on Sundays after church, walking down to the village on what she called a constitutional, and what was, in fact, a visit to Small Jem's grandmother, a woman who had been a laundress and had, in her age, forgotten more than most people would ever know, and who liked, above most things in life, to be asked her opinion. Eleonora asked her opinion. She asked her opinion about how to keep a small boy warm at night when his blanket was thin, and about how much reading was too much for a child not used to it, and about whether it was proper for a duchess to sit on a laundress's step and drink weak tea from a chipped cup. The laundress, whose name was Mrs. Callow, had considered this last question at length, and had said, "Ma'am, propriety is what you carry, not what you sit on." Eleonora had written that down, in her head, and had carried it with her back up the hill to Marchwood Hall, and had entered the great cold echoing entrance under the eye of the 7th Duke in oil, and had felt, for the first time, that the house did not entirely own her. It had, of course, occurred to her that she was concealing what she was doing. She was not lying about it. She was, however, not mentioning it. There is, she knew, a difference, though it is a narrow one, and she walked the narrow line with her hands folded and her chin the exact half-inch that constituted dignity. She had not mentioned the boys because she was, in an honest corner of herself, afraid. She was afraid that if she named the lessons to her husband, he would forbid them, mildly, the way he forbade everything mildly, and she would be obliged to obey mildly, and Small Jem would never learn the whole of his surname, and Ned would go on reckoning hay in his head for other people's profit, and Tom would send half his wages to a sister who could not read the letters he sent with them. She was afraid, too, in a smaller and less honorable corner, of the mockery. He had a way of mocking her that she had come to know as one knows a bruise. He did it lightly, in company, without heat, without malice. in the shape of a compliment. "My wife," he had said once at the county assembly, "has a great gift for listening." It had been meant as a kindness. It had been received by the room as a kindness. Only she had heard the second half of the sentence, the one he had not needed to speak because she has no gift for talking. He had said, on another occasion, at a dinner in the neighboring county, "My wife prefers a small circle." He had meant she had none. He had said in the carriage on the way home from a ball at which she had danced twice and sat out the rest, "You bore yourself very creditably, my dear." She had said, "Thank you." She had not said, "One bears oneself creditably at a funeral too," and this was not so different. She had not, in fact, said anything of the kind aloud, ever, to anyone. But she had thought it, and thinking it was a kind of small, independent country in which she was, at least, sovereign. So when the Duke had walked into the tack room that afternoon, unheralded, and stood over the stubborn primer, and said her name, and looked at her for the length of time it takes a candlewick to draw fresh wax, she had not known which of the several things she feared was about to happen. She had known only that one of them was, and the pause, holding, was the last quiet moment before she found out which. He did not, in the end, speak first. He walked, instead, to the door of the tack room and shut it properly, which required lifting it slightly on its bad hinge and easing it into the jamb, and the small domestic competence of the gesture undid her more than any speech would have. A man who could ease a bad door on its hinge had, at some point in his life, cared enough about a door to learn how. She had not credited him with such a point in his life. She revised, in silence, several assumptions. He turned from the door and leaned, lightly, against the whitewashed wall, and folded his gloved hands in front of him in the way he folded them when he was about to say something he had thought about for longer than he wished to admit. "How long?" he said. She did not pretend not to understand. 6 weeks, she said. "Every week." He nodded once, slowly, as if she had confirmed a figure he had already reckoned. "Who else knows?" "Mr. Fenwick," she said. "Mrs. Peake, I believe, though she has not said so. Coates, possibly. Cook, certainly. Though only because of the loaf." He almost smiled at the loaf. She saw the corner of the eye move and had to look at the primer under the blanket in order not to lose her composure. It struck her, absurdly, that she had spent 142 days composing herself against his coldness, and was now in danger of being undone by a warmth she had not been braced for. She braced. "Why?" he said. The word was so short that for a moment she thought she had misheard it. "Why?" she repeated. Yes, why did she teach them? Or why had she not told him? Or why any of it at all? She chose the largest of the questions, because it seemed to her the least dangerous to answer honestly. "Because they wanted to learn," she said, "and because it cost nothing, and because I had the primer." He watched her for a while. He said, "It cost, surely, your afternoons." "My afternoons," she said, "were not, until then, in use." She had not meant it to sound as it sounded. She had meant it as a plain fact. But she heard it as it left her, and she heard him hear it, and she saw, quite clearly, the small, precise moment in which the Duke of Marchwood, who had a face that never showed anything at all, was hurt. It was the smallest hurt she had ever seen a man take. It moved only the muscle at the hinge of his jaw, and only for the length of a breath. But it moved. She had not known, until then, that she was capable of hurting him. She had assumed, on the evidence of 142 days, that the traffic ran only one way. The discovery, arriving in the tack room among the smell of leather and clean straw, was more disorienting than the primer, more disorienting than the closed door, more disorienting than the sound of her own name in his mouth. It occurred to her that she might, without meaning to, have been cruel? It occurred to her, further, that if she had been cruel without meaning to, then he might, perhaps, have been cruel without meaning to, and that this was a possibility she had not, in her honest, sovereign country of private thoughts, allowed herself to consider. She had allowed herself to consider that he was cold. She had not allowed herself to consider that he might be careful. There is a great difference between the two, though they can wear the same coat. He recovered, of course, at once. He was a Ravenhill, and Ravenhills recovered. He said evenly, "You will need better light." She blinked. "The lamp," he said, with a small nod at the smoky brass thing on the shelf, "is inadequate, and the fire in here on a wet day will not carry a 2-hour lesson. If you are to do this, you should do it properly." "If," she said. "If," he said. "It is not a question I have decided. It is a question you have decided. I would not undo it. I would, however, suggest that the harness room adjoining is drier and takes better light in the afternoon, and that a small table would serve you better than a slate on the knee, and that Mr. Fenwick will not object to the loss of the second peg row, because Mr. Fenwick has been wanting to move it these 3 years and has not liked to ask." She stared at him. He looked, at that moment, exactly as he had looked at the altar of St. Bartholomew the Less on the morning of their wedding, when he had taken her in and looked politely past her. Only now she understood, standing in the tack room with the primer swelling under its blanket, that she had, that morning in the church, misread the look entirely. He had not been looking past her. He had been looking at her, and had seen, in the 12 steps of her walk up the aisle, that she was frightened, and had done the only thing a man of his composure knew how to do with the fear of a woman he had not yet learned. He had given her privacy. He had looked politely away, so that she might arrive at the altar without being watched. She had spent 142 days interpreting that look as indifference. She revised, again, in silence. "Adrian," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. It came out of her mouth without permission and lay between them in the tack room like a small, warm thing, an animal that had wandered in through a bad door. He did not flinch. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Why did you come down here today?" He considered the question with the care he considered everything. "Because Coates told me 3 months ago that you had been looking at the library door. And because I unlocked it and left you a book and you read it, and I did not know what to do next. And because a week ago Mrs. Peake mentioned, without appearing to mention, that a duchess who spends her afternoons in a stable will, in a house of 42 servants, eventually be talked about, and I found that I did not wish you to be talked about, and I did not know how to say so without making it worse. And because this morning Mr. Fenwick, who is a man of very few words, said to me as I dismounted your grace, 'The little missus is teaching my lads their letters, and I thought you should know.' And I stood in the yard for some time, and then I walked down here, because it occurred to me that I have been married to a woman for 142 days whom I have not once asked what she does with her hours, and that this was, upon reflection, a considerable failure. It was the longest speech she had ever heard him make. It was also, she understood, an apology, though he had not used the word, because Ravenhills did not use the word. She stood very still. She said, "At last, you have not failed." He said, mildly, "I have." Then he said, "We agreed on a great many things, you and I, on the day we were married. We agreed to be civil, we agreed to be private, we agreed, I think, to be strangers." He paused. "It seems to me," he said, "that of the 3 agreements, the third is the one I would like, if you will permit it, to renegotiate." She could not speak for a moment. "When she could," she said. "On what terms?" "On any," he said, "that you propose." Outside, in the yard, a bucket touched a stone. The swallow above the door went about her ordinary business. Mr. Fenwick, who had been standing at the far end of the yard for some 10 minutes pretending to examine a bridle, quietly turned his back and walked toward the paddock so that whatever was happening in the tack room might happen without an audience. Small Jem, who had been sent to fetch a bucket and had forgotten why, was singing to himself by the pump, the letter J in his mouth like a fishing hook. Eleonora heard all of it, at once as if the world had grown a new ear for her use, and she looked at her husband leaning against the whitewashed wall in his riding coat, with his gloved hands folded in front of him, and his face composed exactly as it always was, and she saw, for the first time, the man inside the composure, the way one sees a lamp inside a shade only when the room around it has gone dark enough. She said, "I propose that you sit down." He looked, briefly, surprised. Then, without a word, he crossed the tack room and sat carefully on the low bench where the boys had sat and folded his tall self into a space that had not been built for dukes, and looked up at her and waited. She sat beside him. She did not touch him. She did not need to. She reached, instead, under the folded blanket and drew out the stubborn primer and set it, damp and swollen and open, on her knee. She said, "This was my father's. He gave it to me the week before he died. I was 9. It is the only book of his I have." He looked at the primer. He said quietly, "May I?" She turned it, gently, so that he could see. He read, in silence, the child's tracings in the margin, the loop of Small Jem's fishing, hook J, the careful capital N of Ned's name, the wobbly O that Tom had made too large. He did not smile. He did not need to. When he closed the primer, he closed it with the same small domestic competence with which he had eased the bad door on its hinge, and he set it back on the bench between them, and he said, without looking at her, "I owe you an apology." She said, "You owe me none." He said, "I have called you, in company, my wife who prefers a small circle. I have said at dinner that you have a gift for listening. I have said in a carriage that you bore yourself creditably. I have meant, each time, something like a kindness, and each time it has come out crooked, and I have known. Each time, at the moment it came out, that it had come out crooked, and I have not, on any of those occasions, corrected it. That is the apology. I do not ask you to accept it. I ask only that you know I know." She looked at her hands on the primer. She said, very quietly, "I heard the second halves." He said, "I feared you did." There was a silence. It was not the silence of the last 142 days. It was a different silence, of a kind she did not, at that moment, have a name for. She let it hold. He did not fill it. And in the tack room, on the low bench, with the primer between them, and the light leaning incurious against the whitewashed wall, something that had been very cold in the house at the top of the drive began, quietly, to warm. He walked her back to the house that afternoon, which he had not done before, not once, and he did not offer her his arm, which would have been noticed by the servants at the windows, and she did not take his arm, which would have been noticed by herself. They walked side by side at a distance of exactly the width of a polite hedge, and they talked, most of the way, about the harness room, and where a table might stand, and whether the lamp should be brass or tin, and whether a second primer should be sent for from London, or whether it was better, on reflection, to have one made up in the village, so that Mrs. Callow's granddaughter, who had been apprenticed to the printer at Coldbrook and had a fine hand, might have the work. It was, she realized halfway up the drive, the first ordinary conversation she had ever had with her husband. It was about tables and lamps and printers and a laundress's granddaughter, and it was, for that reason, the most extraordinary conversation of her life. At the top of the drive, before they came within sight of the entrance and the eye of the 7th Duke in oil, he stopped. He said, "There is something I should tell you, which I ought to have told you a great while ago, and which will make certain other things less obscure." She waited. He said, "The library was locked on the day you came, because I had not yet had it made ready for you. My father sold, in his last illness, a great number of the books to pay debts that were not his to leave. I have spent, since I came into the title, 4 years restoring the shelves as far as I could. It is not yet what it was. It is not what I would wish to give you. I locked the door because I did not wish you to walk in on the 3rd day of your marriage and see, first, gaps. I unlocked it in the 6th week, because it seemed to me that you would rather see the gaps than nothing at all. I should have told you, on the 1st day, that there were gaps. I did not, because I did not know how to say it without seeming to complain of my father, whom I loved. That is the second apology." She said, after a moment, "I do not think either apology was owed. I think you have been careful of me. And I have mistaken care for coldness. It is a mistake I have made before, in other rooms, with other people, and I have paid for it. I do not wish to make it again." He looked at her. He said, "You are not plain." She almost laughed. She almost cried. She did neither. She said, mildly, "I am. A little. I have a small nose and a round face, and my hair does not oblige. My aunt has been telling me so since I was 11, and my glass has been agreeing since I was 14, and I am, on the whole, at peace with it." He said, "Your aunt is a fool, and your glass is unlit." She did laugh then, a small, startled laugh, and he did not smile with his mouth, but the corner of the eye moved for long enough that even Bosun, the yellow dog, watching from the top step of the entrance, appeared to notice, and did not for once bite anyone. They went in. Life at Marchwood Hall did not, from that afternoon, transform. It rearranged. That is a smaller word and a truer one. The harness room was cleared, a table was put in, a lamp was chosen, tin and not brass, because brass, Mr. Fenwick observed dryly, encouraged dukes to visit. A second primer was made up in the village by Mrs. Callow's granddaughter, whose fine hand was, indeed, fine, and who accepted the commission with a professional gravity that pleased Eleanora more than she could say. Small Jem mastered the whole of his surname within a fortnight. Ned reckoned, in his head, the cost of the new lamp against the cost of a brass one, and pronounced the tin, with satisfaction, the better bargain. Tom, unprompted, wrote his sister in the village a letter of 4 sentences, and cried, later, in the loose box of a mare called Persephone, because he had never before, in his life, made his own words carry on paper. Mrs. Peake began to send down, without being asked, a slate of bread and cheese on lesson afternoons, and, when the weather turned, an extra shawl for her Grace, of a color that suited her, which she had chosen herself from the linen cupboard. Mr. Coates, on his own initiative, moved a small bookshelf into the yellow drawing-room, at the elbow of the chair by the window in which the new Duchess preferred to sit, and stocked it, over the following weeks, with volumes the Duke had, without appearing to. Mentioned, Lady Mercia, who missed nothing, wrote a letter to her cousin in Bath that contained the sentence, "She is not what one expected," which was, from Lady Mercia, an ovation. Bosun, who had bitten Eleanora once in the first week, and had received, in return, not a scream but a mild, interested "oh, so that is what you do," had, by the end of the 2nd month, taken to sleeping across her feet in the yellow drawing-room, and had once, memorably, growled at the Duke on her behalf, when the Duke had come in unannounced, which the Duke had received with the corner of the eye and no comment. The Duke himself, whose habits had been engraved for years, began, without ceremony, to be seen at the stables on lesson afternoons. He did not enter. He stood, sometimes, at the door of the harness room, out of the light, and listened. He said nothing about what he heard, but one evening at dinner, over the fish, he remarked, without looking up, that the tale of the tailor's son and the 3 copper pennies was, in his opinion, the best of the old stories, and that whoever had written it had understood something about small change that most economists did not, and Eleonora, across the long, polished acre of the dining table, understood that he had been listening at the door for longer than she had known. And she did not correct him about the authorship, and she did not name the book, and she smiled, small and inward, and she did not turn her face to the window this time, because she wished him to see the smile and know its cause. He saw. He did not, however, remark upon it. That, too, was a kindness. There was, in all of this, no grand declaration. He did not, at any point in the following months, tell her that he loved her, because Ravenhills did not, and because she would not have believed him if he had said it too quickly. He told her, instead, in 100 small ways, most of which she noticed and some of which she did not. He had her mother's writing desk, which had been sold at auction in the year of her father's death, and which he had traced, without telling her, through 3 counties, brought up to her sitting room and set in the window, with a fresh inkwell and a new blotter and a small vase of the field flowers she had once, in passing, said she preferred. She had come upon it one morning after church, and had stood in the doorway of her sitting room for a long time without going in, and had, at last, gone in, and sat down at it, and put her hands flat on the wood where her mother's hands had been, and had not cried, because she had learned not to, and had, instead, written him a letter of 1 line, which said, "Thank you," and had sent it down to the breakfast room by a maid, and had received back, within the hour, a letter of 1 line in his hand, which said, "It was already yours." She kept the letter in the drawer of the desk, and she kept the desk in the window, and she wrote at it, thereafter, every morning of her life. He had, further, without telling her, sat down with Mr. Fenwick, and arranged that Tom's sister in the village be given the tenancy of a cottage near the church at a rent she could pay, and that the child she was raising, not her own, be sent, when he was old enough, to the school at Coldbrook at the estate's cost, and that Tom, at 17, be offered the place of under-groom, and, at 20, if he wished it, the place of head groom under Mr. Fenwick, who was, Mr. Fenwick admitted, getting on. He had, quietly, established a small school in the village, in the room above the wheelwrights, and had asked Mrs. Callow's granddaughter to keep it, and had said, when Eleonora heard of it and looked at him across the breakfast table, only, it seemed a good idea. Small Jem, at 7, was its first pupil. Ned, at 10, was its first monitor. Tom, at 15, was its first old boy, and came back on Sunday afternoons to help with the reading, and sat in the corner with the smallest children on his knees, and read them, in a voice that had begun to break, and did not quite know yet what to do about it. The tale of the tailor's son and the 3 copper pennies. Mrs. Peake, hearing him one afternoon on her way past, stood still on the gravel again, and again did not deliver her message, and again said nothing at supper, though her eyes were bright. And Eleonora, who now walked through Marchwood Hall in dresses of colors that suited her, chosen by herself, and who had, at last, learned the names of all 73 rooms, and who had, with her husband, unlocked the green drawing-room in which no one had sat since 1789, and had aired it, and lit a small fire in it, and sat in it, once for an afternoon. with a book and a dog and a man who had, without warning, laid his hand on the back of hers, on the arm of the chair, and left it there for the length of a chapter, felt, for the first time in her life, that she was not enduring. She was living. It broke, when it broke, quietly. It broke on a Tuesday afternoon in the harness room. She had been reading to the boys, more than 3 of them now, 7, because word had spread, and Mr. Fenwick's yard had, without any fuss being made about it, become a small and unofficial nursery of letters, and she had come to the end of a story about a woodcutter's daughter who had been thought plain, and had turned out, in the last page, to be exactly herself, which is a small, quiet magic that the old stories know about and pretend not to. She had closed the book. The children had sat, as children do at the end of a good story, in the particular silence that is the highest compliment a listener can pay. She had looked up to say something ordinary about the small beer and had found her husband standing in the doorway of the harness room. In the light this time, not out of it, and had seen, on the face that never showed anything at all, that he had heard the last page, and that the last page had reached, in him, a place that he had not, perhaps, known was still capable of being reached. He did not speak. He did not need to. He inclined his head, the exact 1/4 of an inch he had inclined it to Small Jem on the first day, and he turned, and he went back up the drive alone, and she let him. Because there are moments in a life when the kindest thing you can do for a person is to let him walk up a drive by himself. That evening, after dinner, he came to her sitting room, which he had never done, and he stood in the doorway, and he said, mildly, "May I come in?" She said, yes. He came in. He sat, not in the chair opposite hers, but on the low stool by the fire, at her feet, which was not a place a Duke of Marchwood had sat ever in the history of the family. He put his hands, ungloved for once, on his knees. He said, "I have been a fool." She said, "No." He said, "I have." He said, "I married you because it was arranged, and I resented, at first, being arranged. And I visited that resentment upon you, because you were the piece of the arrangement I could see. I called you plain, in company, because I did not know how else to punish an arrangement, and I did not think, at the time, that a word said lightly could travel as far as it travels. It has traveled. I have followed it, these last months, into every room of this house, and I have taken it back where I could, and where I could not I have paid what it cost. I do not, however, wish to keep paying. I wish, instead, to say, once and clearly, and only once, so that I do not embarrass either of us by repetition, that you are not plain, and were never plain, and that I have watched you, these 6 months, teach 7 children the shapes of their names. And I have understood, watching you, that I did not marry a plain wife. I married a woman who can teach a child to write his own name, which is, if you consider it, the beginning of every kind of freedom there is. I do not know what to do with this understanding except to lay it at your feet, which I am doing, literally, at this moment, because I am, as you see, sitting on a stool. She looked at him. She could not speak, for a while. When she could, she said, "Adrian." He said, "Yes," she said, "come up." And he came up, and sat in the chair opposite hers, and took her hand, and held it, and did not speak, and did not need to. And in the sitting room at Marchwood Hall, with the fire low, and Bosoon the yellow dog asleep across her feet, and the field flowers in her mother's vase on her mother's desk, and the primer, damp and swollen and stubborn, in the drawer where she kept the things that mattered, Eleanora Whitcomb, who had been called plain in company, and had borne it creditably, was, at last, truly seen. And being seen, in the end, was as quiet as she had always suspected it would be. In the years that followed, Tom did indeed take Mr. Fenwick's place, and married the printer's daughter from Coldbrook, and had, in due course, 3 boys of his own, all of whom could read before they were 6, which he considered, quite rightly, his finest accomplishment. Ned went, at 14, to the grammar school at Coldbrook on a scholarship the Duke had, without telling anyone, endowed, and from there to a counting house in London, and from there to a small bank of his own, and from there, at 40, back to the village where he built a house within sight of the stables, and reckoned hay, on Sundays, for Mr. Fenwick's successor, for the pleasure of it. Small Jem, whose true name turned out to be Jeremy Callow, became the schoolmaster of the little school above the wheelwrights, and taught, at various times, most of the children of the parish, and read to them, at the end of every Friday afternoon, the tale of the tailor's son and the 3 copper pennies, which he had, by that time, entirely by heart, and which he read, always, with the small changes of voice a duchess had taught him when he was 5. Mrs. Peake retired at 70, with a pension, and lived to see the christening of the 4th Ravenhill child, and pronounced the baby, with her old flat practiced kindness, a plain little thing with a heart, which was, in Mrs. Peake's language, a blessing. Lady Mercia, who lived to be very old and very grand and very fond, in the end of her nephew's wife, left, in her will to Eleonora, the pearls she had refused to lend her on the morning of the wedding, with a note that said only, "You have earned them, and they are, at last, the right color for you." Mr. Coates outlived his employer by 2 years and was buried, at his own request, near the yew, and had inscribed on his stone the single word discreet, which was, everyone agreed, exactly what he would have wanted. Bosun the yellow dog, who lived in the manner of small yellow dogs, considerably longer than seemed reasonable, died at last on a rug in front of the fire in the yellow drawing-room, at the feet of the woman he had once bitten, and was buried under the rose by the door, with a small flat stone on which nothing was written, because the household could not agree on what to write, and because he had, in life, expressed no preference. And the Duke and Duchess of Marchwood lived, as the phrase goes, and as, in their case, was true, quietly. They were not much talked of in the county after the first year or 2, because they gave the county very little to talk about, which is the truest measure of a happy marriage. They opened the library and filled its gaps, slowly, over a lifetime, and left it, at the end, more complete than it had been in the Duke's grandfather's day. They opened the green drawing-room and sat in it often, and no one, thereafter, was afraid of it. They had 4 children, 3 of whom lived, and all of whom learned their letters, first, in a harness room, on a low bench, from a woman who did not, in any of the portraits later painted of her, look plain at all. And now, you and I sit here, together, by this fire, at the end of another story, and the room around us has gone quiet in that particular way rooms do when a tale has been properly told. If you have ever, in your own life, been called a small word in company and borne it creditably, and gone on, quietly, doing the work that mattered to you, and been, at last, truly seen by someone who had not, at first, known how to look, then you know already what happened in the harness room at Marchwood Hall, and I have only reminded you of it. Tell me, if you will, which moment stayed with you tonight? The primer that would not close, or Small Jem's fishing hook J, or the letter of 1 line, or the stool by the fire, or the last page of the story of the woodcutter's daughter. I would like to know. And if you would like to sit by this fire again, on another evening, for another story, come back and pull up a chair. There is always room. There is always tea. There is always another tale waiting, quietly, for its turn. Sleep well, my friend. The fire will keep, and so will I, and so, until we meet again, will the story.